Remember that time Christopher Nolan didn't even go to film school? He attended the University College of London where he studied English literature. That's right, Nolan is a self-taught filmmaker through and through, yet he's responsible for making the biggest and most successful Batman movie in film history, twice over. In fact, no Batman movie has passed the $1 billion mark before or since Nolan's films. What made The Dark Knight such a gigantic success, especially when you consider that Nolan hadn't even planned to make a trilogy, let alone a sequel to his DC movie debut, Batman Begins? How did the film maneuver the death of its breakout star? And how did the film influence the future of comic book movies going forward? Well, sit back, relax, grab a magic pencil, and let's take a look at the chaotic past of The Dark Knight. In 2006, Christopher Nolan was coming off of the dueling magician film, The Prestige. Now it was time to turn his attention to something he wasn't sure he'd be doing up to this point, making a follow-up to his successful reboot of Batman. This time though, the studio was practically begging him to return for the sequel. They were very happy with what he had done with Batman Begins, plus they had no intention of repeating their mistakes from the past. Batman Begins grossed $206 million in America and an additional $166 million overseas, the combined total of which was $373 million. This was very respectable, however, it wasn't groundbreaking by any means. In fact, if it weren't for his fresh take on the material, as well as the highly positive reception from audiences and critics alike, Warner Brothers would have probably looked elsewhere for a director to helm the sequel. Batman Begins was a globetrotting film with massive scope. Nolan felt he couldn't get any more epic in those terms, so he decided to take a different approach for the sequel. Nolan was inspired by the Michael Mann film Heath, and decided to model his new Batman film after it. By the way, this would be the first film in the Caped Crusaders history to not have Batman in the title. I remember when it was first announced that there would be a sequel to Batman Begins. For a long time it was simply referred to as Batman Begins 2. When I heard the final title of the movie, The Dark Knight, I was ecstatic. It's so simple, but the name change did a lot to signal that this movie would be different than the ones that came before. An aspect of the movie that everyone usually focuses on is the Joker, and that's because Heath Ledger gave a mesmerizing performance. When people first heard that Ledger was going to play the Joker, everyone gave a collective, "What the?" It just made zero sense at the time. He had demonstrated that he was a good actor, don't get me wrong, but nothing could prepare people for the transformative performance he ended up giving. Heath had actually come in to meet with Christopher Nolan before Batman Begins had cast its lead role. That's right, he was there to discuss playing Batman. But in true Heath Ledger fashion, he assured Nolan personally that he wasn't right for the role. In fact, Ledger didn't want to play a superhero at all. He just couldn't get his head around it. However, after he saw what Christopher Nolan did with Batman Begins and found out that the role of the Joker was up for grabs, he wasted no time in seizing the opportunity of a lifetime. Despite the casting rumors of Robin Williams, Paul Bettany, or Johnny Depp taking on the role, Nolan had already made up his mind about Heath Ledger. He even said that the reason Ledger was perfect for the Joker was he was fearless. Heath always had an honest and upfront attitude in interviews. When talking to the Toronto Star newspaper, he said this, "I wouldn't have thought of me either, but it's obviously not going to be what Jack Nicholson did. It's going to be more nuanced and dark and more along the lines of A Clockwork Orange." It didn't hurt that the idea for the movie this time around was heavily fueled by the Joker character. He was the locomotive that drove the entire story. All of this was the perfect storm needed to create an iconic performance. More on that in a bit. The Dark Knight is about the retaliation of Gotham criminals in response to Batman taking the law into his own hands. It was approached like a crime drama set in the world of Batman. Christian Bale, Michael Caine, and Morgan Freeman all returned for the sequel. The only actor who didn't get back on board this time around was Katie Holmes. She was busy filming the movie Mad Money. Personally, I think Maggie Gyllenhaal was a great replacement who added gravitas and believability to the role. Also, like on Batman Begins, Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard returned for double duty as composers on this film. However, it seems like Hans Zimmer was more heavily involved this time around, taking on some of the juicier parts of the film. Not to discredit what James Newton Howard added to the score. For example, Howard was responsible for writing the heroic musical suite for Harvey Dent. Zimmer, on the other hand, spent a lot of his time perfecting the Joker theme. According to the book The Nolan Variations, Zimmer spent months plugging away at old synthesizers, making crazy noises, and recording musicians experimentally. Razor blades on piano wire, pencils scratching tables and floors, all in pursuit of finding the Joker's ominous sound. Nolan had requested a demo tape from Zimmer to listen to on his way to Hong Kong while doing some location scouting for The Dark Knight. Zimmer put together 9,000 bars of experimental music and put it on an iPod for Nolan. Nolan listened to it on his flight and said, "It was a pretty unpleasant experience, frankly." However, he felt that Zimmer had cracked the theme and left it to the composer to fine-tune it from there. Zimmer had been working on the score a whole 6 months before filming began. That meant that Nolan knew what his movie sounded like before rolling one frame of film. What a great way to get pumped up before a shoot, you know? Strangely enough, this would be the last time Nolan would work with two composers at the same time. He and Zimmer took their partnership onto Inception, The Dark Knight Rises, Interstellar, and Dunkirk. However, they haven't worked together since then, with composer Ludwig Göransson taking over as composer on Tenet and the upcoming Oppenheimer. Apparently, Nolan was a little upset when Zimmer chose to score Dune instead of Tenet. Plus, Zimmer was also busy doing live performances of his scores, which led to a packed schedule. Hopefully they'll team up again in the future because they make a good team. Anyway, the budget of The Dark Knight was $185 million. Let's compare that with the $150 million spent on Batman Begins. It's actually not that much of an increase when you compare the budgets between Batman Begins and the third film in the series, The Dark Knight Rises. The Dark Knight Rises would end up costing $250 million to make, which was $100 million more than Begins. I bring this up to show how measured and controlled Nolan was with this film. He didn't throw a ton of money at the movie to make it artificially bigger. Instead, he invested his time in making this sequel more innovative. Right away, Nolan made a distinct change to the look of Batman. With the Burton and Schumacher films, the Batman suit was much more restrictive. Batman Begins had this issue as well. The bat turn was an unspoken tradition that was a constant throughout all the movies that came before The Dark Knight. Nolan was determined to solve this problem, and he even made it a plot point of the film. When Lucius Fox hears that Bruce Wayne wants to be able to turn his head, that was probably something that all of the previous actors playing Batman wanted as well. In the past, the Batman cowl connected to the neck, which in turn made neck mobility comically limited. This time around, the costume designers split the suit up into pieces, like a suit of armor. These pieces of armor were placed on an elastic mesh. The bat cowl was now more like a motorcycle helmet in terms of mobility. It was no longer connected to the neck. Now, Christian Bale would have the full range of motion while acting in the bat suit. It's brilliant how they showed the before and after of this in the movie. It's like Night and The Dark Knight. Ow! Also, the look of Two-Face was much more gnarly than we were used to seeing in a Batman movie. This look was achieved with a mix of prosthetics and CGI. The prosthetics were minimal, but they helped Aaron Eckhart get a feel for what he would look like in the final film. Those teeth, you can see his teeth through the, it's great. Another big difference from the first movie to this one was the look of Gotham City. Nolan and production designer Nathan Crowley decided to embrace a modern aesthetic this time around. I had to look that up. Modern aesthetic means function over form in design. So basically, it was more realistic. That was something Nolan was quoted as saying he wasn't comfortable doing on the first film. At first glance, you might think that The Dark Knight looks too normal when compared with Batman Begins. For one thing, Wayne Tower looks like a different building altogether. In the first film, it was a more gothic-looking structure. Now, it was replaced with a modern and sleek-looking building, which makes total sense. Wayne Tower was significantly damaged at the end of Batman Begins when Ra's al Ghul crashed the monorail into it. This also explains why that gigantic monorail network that ran through Gotham in Batman Begins is now absent. In The Dark Knight, the focus was on the corrupt business district of Gotham. That's why locations like the Narrows and Arkham Asylum aren't shown this time around. We're in a much different part of the city. It was also a ballsy move to not only burn down Wayne Manor in Batman Begins, but to keep the Batcave and Wayne Manor out of the equation fully for this movie. It gave a completely different feel than we as an audience were used to. A big improvement was made to Batman's fight scenes as well. This time around, the fight scenes were clearer and shot in longer takes so that we as an audience could actually see what was happening. Batman Begins approached its fight scenes with such a flurry of cuts that it was almost too hard to understand what was happening. Nolan used the quick cutting style in that film to demonstrate what Batman's foes were seeing. However, he embraced clarity and intensity for the fight scenes in The Dark Knight, and honestly, it's better for it. Up until this point, the Joker had been portrayed in an overly faithful way to the comic books. There was a common thread from the TV series, to Batman '89, to the animated series in the 90s. Nolan and Ledger knew that The Dark Knight's Joker would have to be something very different. Not just for different sake, but for the sake of fitting the world Nolan had built up to this point. A world with a darker and more realistic tone. Joker had always been well groomed for a clown in all of the TV and movie versions up to this point. Short hair, bleached white skin, well-kept suit. In contrast, Ledger's Joker applied his own makeup and hair dye. It's also nice to see a Joker who doesn't take the time to get his hair cut, you know? He doesn't care about vanity or being well kept. The reason for his Joker smile was caused by a brutal carving of the face from unknown origins. His style was effortless. Couple that with how Heath came up with a split persona light years from anything we had seen of him or the character, and baby, you got a stew. To prep for the role of the Joker, Heath went through a very thorough process. He locked himself in a hotel room for weeks and kept a diary that delved into how the Joker thinks. He became so engrossed that he would sleep an average of 2 hours a night. To get the voice of the Joker, Heath teamed up with a dialect coach, and if you've ever heard Tom Waits talk, yeah, that guy is the Joker in real freaking life. Filming began in April of 2007. So what did they do on the first 4 days of filming? Well, they didn't film anything at all. They spent that time under Christopher Nolan's insistence watching Batman Begins, 1942's Cat People, Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, Black Sunday, Billy Wilder's Stalag 17, the original King Kong, Citizen Kane, and Michael Mann's Heat. These were to demonstrate the look and feel Nolan was going for. The first sequence to be filmed was the opening bank heist scene, which was shot in Chicago, Illinois. The decision to shoot this section first was a strategic one. Nolan and cinematographer Wally Pfister wanted to get their feet wet with the IMAX cameras that they would be using for key scenes of The Dark Knight. Now, the heist was shot over 5 days. It took 4 days to process the IMAX film, which was a nerve-wracking experience for Nolan and company as they waited to see how their opening scene was turning out. They wanted to find out early on if they needed to reshoot the scene with traditional film cameras. The other purpose for filming the opening IMAX sequence first was that Nolan and Warner Brothers wanted to use it as a sneak preview for audiences before the film actually came out. It would be shown during IMAX screenings of I Am Legend. This was the first movie to shoot some of its scenes with IMAX cameras. Each one of the 4 IMAX cameras available to the world at that time cost $500,000 in insurance. There's no question it was worth it, and the scenes they shot them with, the prologue, the Hong Kong rooftop sequence, the Lamborghini crash, the armored car chase, and the climax with the Joker at Trump Tower near the end, were all gloriously amplified on screen. While it made for a larger-than-life feel in the movie theaters, it was also a pain in the butt to work with. All the sequences shot with IMAX cameras during scenes with dialogue had to be redubbed in post-production due to the loud noise the cameras made while filming. Not too big a deal, but for someone who prefers to have as much dialogue from the day of shooting as possible, it must have been annoying for Christopher Nolan to contend with. Unfortunately, during the armored car chase, the IMAX camera they were shooting with broke. That's right, that scene cost an additional $500,000 more than they were expecting due to the heavy-duty IMAX camera getting destroyed. One of the first dialogue-heavy scenes featuring the Joker was the scene at Wayne Tower during the party held for Harvey Dent. A lot of the actors and extras were getting their first ever peek at the new Joker. Ledger's performance has taken on an otherworldly status since the release of this film. It's often portrayed that he was fully confident, even possessed by this role. In reality, though, Heath was still a young, growing artist. Sure, the performance that ended up on screen was some of the best acting in film history, but Ledger wasn't always so sure of himself during production. In the book, The Nolan Variations, Christopher Nolan talked about his experience directing Ledger during the scene at Wayne Tower. Here's what he said. "It was one of the earlier scenes we shot, and I was like, you have to be this force of nature. This is a fancy party. You walk in and you just piss in the soup. And when we finished shooting it, he was like, "Thanks for pushing me on that." Heath was a very lovely guy. I don't think it was in any way natural to him to walk in and be that cruel, because there's immense cruelty to the Joker. There's an enjoyment of the uncomfortable place in which he puts everybody. He was like, "You gave me an excuse to be horrible." He really didn't like making people feel uncomfortable. Also, the trust that Nolan had for Ledger grew exponentially throughout the filming, resulting in the director letting Ledger film and direct this scene by himself. Michael Jai White, who played Gamble and of course Spawn, gave some major insight into what Heath Ledger was like on set during an interview with Collider. He said, "Heath Ledger was having a ball. We were giving him a wide berth and not bothering him, but he was the one initiating conversations and we were doing magic tricks and all kinds of silly things. We would hold up the camera with us just trading jokes, and then when we were done, we would get to shooting. I don't think I've ever been on a more relaxed stage." He was so incredibly chill. The first day he comes in, we shoot half the day and he's in full makeup. Cameras beside him and he's talking to the boardroom. We break for lunch and I ask the director, "So what are we shooting after lunch?" And he says, "We're gonna finish up this side of the room." And I'm like, "So you mean to tell me that Heath has been in hours of makeup and he's not going to be on camera anytime today?" And he said, "Yeah." And I was like, wow, he did that for us. Heath Ledger was in full creative flow. The kind of creative flow that could turn inconveniences into character tics. For example, when it came time for shooting, the prosthetics of his lip scars were lined halfway inside his mouth. In order to keep them from moving around while he spoke, he would lick his lips to make it stay put. The compulsive licking of the lips became an iconic part of his character. He would also ask Christian Bale to hit him for real during the interrogation scene. That may sound unnecessary, but you know what? It also seems like fun. The Joker character wasn't the only reason that The Dark Knight was a must-see event. One of the things that makes a Christopher Nolan film a special event is his commitment to practical effects and stunts. It makes all the difference for the viewers. We can tell when there are tangible things happening on screen. There were several stunts in The Dark Knight that used practical effects. For example, Christian Bale convinced Nolan to let him stand on top of the Willis Tower, which happens to be Chicago's tallest building. The truck flipping scene? This made my particular theater gasp with joy when it played out on screen. It was achieved by placing a TNT charge to the base of a piston that was attached underneath the truck. Once the piston was detonated, it struck the ground so forcefully that the truck was able to flip over completely. This was all done on location in the middle of the Chicago banking district. And yeah, a stunt driver was really in the truck when it flipped. Props to that brave soul. This very scene would be copied in Fast and Furious 9, and actually the Avengers sort of did it too. Christopher Nolan's original plan for scenes involving the Batpod was to have Batman's cape fold back into his suit's backpack, similar to how Batman's cape is folded in during the Hong Kong rooftop scene. This was because he and the other crew members figured it would be a safety hazard to have a stuntman driving a 400-pound bat cycle with the chance of their cape sucking them under the back wheel. However, they found out while they were filming that the cape actually caught the flow of the wind and never posed a threat, which is great because it looks more iconic to have Batman's cape flowing behind him during those scenes. Sadly, an accident infinitely more tragic than breaking an IMAX camera happened during filming. According to the Evening Standard, special effects technician Conway Wycliffe was filming a stunt from the back seat of a Nissan 4x4 which missed a turn and ran into a tree at 20 miles per hour. He was hanging out of the window while filming. Conway Wycliffe was a father of two when he died of severe injuries and was pronounced dead at the scene. He had worked as a special effects technician on Batman Begins, V for Vendetta, Die Another Day, and Casino Royale, to name a few. Rest in peace. Overall, it took 127 days to complete filming. On January 22, 2008, 6 months before The Dark Knight was to be released, news stations around the world announced the shocking death of Heath Ledger at the age of 28. It would eventually be deemed an accidental overdose of prescription drugs. It had been a whirlwind of emotions when it came to Ledger's involvement with the film. He went from being almost universally doubted to universally mourned. Now, the promising actor in the prime of his career was gone. So I'm in the middle of editing this video, and I read an article written by Christopher Nolan not too long after Heath Ledger's death. It's called Charisma as Natural as Gravity, and I think it gives some insights not only into Heath Ledger, but into Christopher Nolan. Let's read it. One night, as I'm standing on LaSalle Street in Chicago trying to line up a shot for The Dark Knight, a production assistant skateboards into my line of sight. Silently, I cursed the moment that Heath first skated onto our set in full character makeup. I'd fretted about the reaction of Batman fans to a skateboarding Joker, but the actual result was a proliferation of skateboards among the younger crew members. If you'd asked those kids why they had chosen to bring their boards to work, they would have answered honestly that they didn't know. That's real charisma. As invisible and natural as gravity. That's what Heath had. Heath was bursting with creativity. It was in his every gesture. He once told me that he liked to wait between jobs until he was creatively hungry, until he needed it again. He brought that attitude to our set every day. There aren't many actors who can make you feel ashamed of how often you complain about doing the best job in the world. Heath was one of them. One time, he and another actor were shooting a complex scene. We had 2 days to shoot it, and at the end of the first day, they'd really found something, and Heath was worried that he might not have it if we stopped. He wanted to carry on and finish. It's tough to ask the crew to work late when we all know there's plenty of time to finish it the next day, but everyone seemed to understand that Heath had something special and that we had to capture it before it disappeared. Months later, I learned that as Heath left the set that night, he quietly thanked each crew member for working late. Quietly. Not trying to make a point, just grateful for the chance to create that they'd given him. Those nights on the street of Chicago were filled with stunts. These can be boring times for an actor, but Heath was fascinated, eagerly accepting our invitation to ride in the camera car as we chased vehicles through moving traffic. Not just for the thrill ride, but to be a part of it, of everything. He'd brought his laptop along in the car, and we had a high-speed screening of 2 of his works in progress, short films he'd made that were exciting and haunting. Their exuberance made me feel jaded and let in. I've never felt as old as I did watching Heath explore his talents. That night, I made him an offer, knowing he wouldn't take me up on it, that he should feel free to come by the set when he had a night off so he could see what we were up to. When you get into the edit suite after shooting a movie, you feel a responsibility to an actor who has trusted you, and Heath gave us everything. As we started to make my cut, I would wonder about each take we chose, each trim we made. I would visualize the screening where we'd have to show him the finished film, sitting 3 or 4 rows behind him, watching the movements of his head for clues to what he was thinking about what we'd done with all that he'd given us. Now that screening will never be real. I see him every day in my edit suite. I study his face, his voice, and I miss him terribly. Back on LaSalle Street, I turn to my assistant director and I tell him to clear the skateboarding kid out of my line of sight when I realize it's Heath, woolly hat pulled low over his eyes, here on his night off to take me up on my offer. I can't help but smile. Wow, I think that says it all. Before Ledger's death, the actor had completed all of his scenes, including post-production audio replacement. Inevitably, rumors of the Joker role taking its toll on him were floating around like crazy at the time. Had he succumbed to method acting that pushed his psyche over the edge? According to his family and co-stars, no. He wasn't always in character like a method actor would be. Between takes, he was happy and down to earth. In interviews, he had stated how the Joker was probably the most fun he will ever have with a role. His family spoke about how he couldn't wait to see the final product. No, his was an accidental death. It sounds morbid to say, but it only added to the hype of this movie. In spite of the sadness surrounding Ledger's death, Warner Brothers still had to gear up their marketing campaign for the film, and it was one of the most unique and effective ways of doing so in recent history. 15 months prior to the film's release, a company called 42 Entertainment unleashed an immersive marketing campaign called Why So Serious? It started at the 2007 San Diego Comic-Con with a 1-800 number written in the sky. Fans could dial the number to receive a voicemail from the Joker looking for recruits. The con was littered with clues and scavenger hunts from the Joker, including a $1 bill with a Joker's face on it and the catchphrase, "Why so serious?" and an Uncle Sam poster with Joker's face giving coordinates in San Diego to meet and join Joker's team. The event expanded beyond Comic-Con as Joker requested for fans to take pictures in Joker makeup around various landmarks. Fan submissions would receive copies of the Gotham Times. After Comic-Con, dozens of comic-centric websites emerged, including an immersive fake election to elect Harvey Dent as district attorney. Over the course of the entire marketing campaign, the more fans participated in the scavenger hunts, games, puzzles, and events, the more prizes they would receive, like a baked cake with a phone inside. Which is freaking awesome, but also pretty creepy. It was such an effective campaign that it led to a bomb evacuation at the Texas news station KENS-TV. They received the cake, which was sent in an unmarked box. When they took the cake out, there were wires protruding from it, and yeah, you can understand why that would freak them out. No charges were pressed against the marketing team at Warner Brothers. that is pretty hardcore. It was labeled as one of the most interactive movie campaigns ever hatched by Hollywood, by the Los Angeles Times. Once the movie debuted on July 18th, 2008, everyone went batshit crazy for it. It broke all sorts of records on its way to grossing $1 billion at the box office. Any doubt about Heath Ledger's ability to play the Joker evaporated completely. In fact, Ledger ended up winning a posthumous Oscar at the Academy Awards that year. It set the bar so high critically and financially that it has yet to be matched by another Batman film. Director Christopher Nolan was riding high, as was everyone else involved with the film. What was next for Nolan? Another Dark Knight saga? Nope. It was time to explore the architecture of the mind. But we'll leave that for another video. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Scotty Dunn, and if you're just a freak, like me, then don't forget to put a smile on the like and subscribe button's face. That stuff really helps the channel. See you next time.